welcome to our currently 130 participants. I am Makx Dekkers, as Agnieszka introduced. I have been involved over the years both with DCAT at W3C and DCAT-AP development of those, and the work continues on both counts. And what we want to do in this first webinar is provide some general information about DCAT, DCAT-AP, the way it was developed, the ideas behind it. So what I wanted to do today is give you an impression of what it is all about. So I will tell you something about metadata. I will tell you about the history and objectives of DCAT and DCAT-AP, so that you understand the basic model behind DCAT, some examples of DCAT entities, and then also look at the differences between DCAT, DCAT-AP, and DCAT-AP-OP, which is the application profile that was developed for the Publications Office of the EU. And then at the end, I will address some general issues that came up during the development of DCAT, and then there will be a possibility for questions. In the middle, we have a 5-minute break, just around 10:35 or 10:40, for you to stretch your legs and grab another cup of coffee, and then we'll continue after that. And we have 2 question sessions, question possibilities at each of the 2 sessions, the one before the break and the one after the break. So one thing for people who are new to all of this, the idea that behind the DCAT and other standards is that there is a split between the things in the world and the descriptions of the things in the world. And we call those descriptions metadata. A basic example of the label on a can, that you know what's inside, a catalog card that describes the book that is available in the library. And in the case of data sets,
I'm sorry, Max, that I'm interrupting you, but there is a request that the sound is very bad, so I don't know if you could fix the microphone.
I don't know.
Sorry for disturbing.
Do you hear me well?
For me, I can hear you well, so I don't know if Corinne, could you?
So maybe
it sounds good for me.
But maybe okay. That for the person that has the problem.
There are like an echo. I don't know. Maybe you're not.
Now I think. But maybe if you, I think that. We can.
Okay.
We will see how it goes, but apparently for most of us it's going well. So.
Okay. So I'll try to speak up a little bit so that people with bad connections can also hear. So I was saying that in the sense of data sets, we have an example here of a spreadsheet on the right-hand side, at the bottom, and DCAT actually describes that information. So we're talking about metadata. We're not talking about the actual data that is being provided. So the one idea that is behind DCAT and DCAT-AP is that it creates interoperability for data catalogues. And the environment that we have currently in Europe starts on the top level with the European Data Portal that gets information, that allows information to be sent to it using the DCAT-AP specification. And there are the various sources for these metadata descriptions. National data portals. On the left-hand side, you can see that there are national data portals that in turn aggregate data from regional or specific data portals, and they use national profiles for DCAT. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there is also an environment at the European Commission around the EU Open Data Portal, where the information is gathered from different institutions. So in the end, the whole environment, the network, then allows for hierarchical aggregation of data from very local situations to a European situation. And that's the whole idea behind DCAT-AP, that there is a standard that allows you to share information in this way. Okay, so just about the scope and the objectives and the timeline of DCAT itself. So DCAT is the data catalog vocabulary. It's a vocabulary designed to facilitate this interoperability that I just showed in the diagram. DCAT enables a publisher to describe the data set and also the data service in a catalog using a standard model. That facilitates then the consumption aggregation of metadata from multiple catalogs. So the whole idea was that you would have the possibility to share information across a wide range of systems. This was an idea that came up in around 2010 at the University of Galway. Barry, the institute there, had the idea that because at the time there were lots of governments around Europe that were starting to publish open data, they had the idea that it would be very useful to have a standard that could be used to do this, rather than having different governments doing things in a different way, so that you actually didn't have the possibility to aggregate them. It was then taken over in 2012 by W3C, the Internet Standards Organization, that had a working group at the time that was called the Government Linked Data Working Group, because there were people mostly from public sector, from government, who were interested in this. And the development of that led to the W3C recommendation, which is the highest level of specification published by W3C in January 2014. So it took between the initial idea to the standard about 4 years to get this discussed and finalized. It was then handed over to a group that was called the W3C Dataset Exchange Working Group, who then worked further on the standard that was published in 2014. And then in February 2020, so about a year ago, it published a second version of DCAT. And currently the version 3 of DCAT is under development at W3C. That's sort of the timeline. You can see that it takes a little while for standards to develop and for standards also to be maintained. And this is an ongoing process, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, also in the context of DCAT-AP. So if we look at DCAT, we can look at version 1 first, the one that was published in 2014, that had a sort of a chain of entities that were described. The catalog, which is the collection of datasets, and the dataset, which is the conceptual content of the dataset, and the distribution, which describes the file. So the catalog is a curated collection of metadata. It has on the bottom you can see that there is a bunch of files. The bunch of files is described as distributions, so specific available forms of datasets. The things that are common across a number of files are described as a dataset, which is defined as a collection of data published or curated by a single agent and available for access or download in one or more formats. And then the catalog describes sort of the set of datasets that belong together in some way, or that are seen by the publisher as a group, as a collection. There was one extra thing in the main entities, is the catalog record. And the catalog record actually describes the metadata of the dataset. So you can see that when you have these datasets in the catalog, then there is the description of the data set is also something that can change. So the catalog record says, for example, when the data set information was entered into the catalog. So you have this extra facility to provide information about the description of the data set. But just take into account that the only actual data, the only actual thing that is there is the file on the bottom. So all the rest that you see there is descriptions of the files. And that is probably interesting to understand that we're here talking not about the files, we're talking about the description of the file. So giving a couple of examples of these things that are being described, and on this screen and on further screens, you can see three parts here. On the left hand screen, you can see how this is defined in the standard. So the standard has these boxes where you can see the entities and all the descriptors of the entities that you can use and how they are related together. In the middle, I show a couple of things that could be descriptors of examples of these entities. And on the right-hand side is something that you might not want to go into details at the moment, because that's something that we're handling in the second webinar, is how you can actually express that in code, how that can be implemented. So for the catalog, as I said, the catalog describes a collection of data sets. So the information that you will find there is the title of the catalog. Usually catalogs have home pages, so you have a link here where you can see further information about the catalog. Publishers, the languages that are in the data sets, and very importantly here is a theme vocabulary. So in the case that we're going to look at further on in the webinars, we're in many cases looking at EU vocabularies. EU vocabularies is a collection of concepts that are maintained by the publications office and have, for example, the one that is the data theme, where there are 13 themes that can be used for the description of the subject of a data set. And then the catalog also links to all the data sets that are included in the catalog. So this is a way that you can have an overview of the information that is provided as part of the catalog. If we then look at the data set of course is a very important one, because it's sort of the central entity in the description. You can again see the box of the descriptors that are described in the standard, and on the right the way you can implement that. The data set basically describe what it is, what the data is about, who published it, when it was published, everything that is important for a user to understand what they are looking at. In this case, the example that I have here is a data set of COVID-19, coronavirus data that was published by the European Center for Diseases. And that data set in this example would have the theme health, which is one of the themes in this data theme vocabulary that I mentioned earlier. You can say what the language is in the data set. There can be multiple languages, of course. You can say what the frequency is that is being updated or being published, and you can have a link to the various distributions of the data set. In this case, there is an example where there are two ways of publishing, but you could have Excel files, you could have HTML distributions. So that is what's in the data set can actually link to those distributions in the description. So the catalog record that I referred to earlier actually describes what happens to the description of the data set. So you can say that the information about the data set was put in the catalog on a particular day, or when the metadata for the dataset was changed, and of course the catalog record would then link to the dataset that it provides information about. So the adding to the catalog, the modification of it, maybe also the source where it came from could be provided there, and that is something that sometimes is useful for people to see what the history was of the description of the dataset. Then the distribution, as I said, the distribution actually describes the actual file. So you will have here, for example, the access URL, which is the place where you actually find the data. So when you have gone through searching the dataset, you will find distribution, and distribution then will have links to where actually the file is, so you can actually download or access it. And it will, of course, say what the format is of the file. It will have a description. And one thing that has always been an important discussion in the work on DCAT is the license. One thing is that you can have a look when you go to a catalog and you search for data sets, but it's important when you can have access to the file that you know what you can do with it. So in many places where we have open data, where we have government data, it's important for people to understand what you can do with the data. In many cases, people might have a little bit of a difficulty with that, but we always have recommended to people to be very clear about the licenses so that it's clear what you can do with it. What happened in the development of DCAT was that people found that there were some things missing in the first version of the standard. And one thing that was particularly important for people was this way that you can link from distributions to files. Now, there were a lot of people who said, well, but not all the distributions that we have are in the form of actual files. We have also situations where we have data services, where there is an API, for example, where you can get to the data by using an interface. And therefore, what happened is in version 2, a data service entity was added, which is defined as a collection of operations that provides access to one or more data set or data processing functions. So you can see in the diagram that the data service is related to the data set, and because the data service provides access to data sets, but there's also a link from distributions to data services, because it might well be that you have a distribution that is available through a data service. So there's the two ways that you can do that. And you can see on the bottom, you have here now two ways of accessing data. There's either files, which are direct in a distribution, or there are API accesses that are described by a data service. Now there is also this red box around catalog, dataset, and data service. That was because at the time people were discussing this and said, well, yeah, data services could also be part of a catalog. And then they said, well, but then there is sort of a grouping of things that share some aspects, share some descriptors. The catalog is also has some descriptors about, for example, who the publisher is, which is what's also a data set and a data service have. So what the standard did was create an overarching class for those three things. So you can have a resource, could be a catalog, it could be a data set, it could be a data service, and they share a number of descriptors. This is more like a, let's say, a specification trick. It wouldn't be expected that people have resources by themselves. They would also always be either a catalog, a data set, or a data service. So that's something that if you look at the standard, you might find that an interesting approach. But in the end, what you really want to describe is these catalogs, data sets, and data services with their distribution. For the example of a data service, I have made one up here where you have the possibility to get to dataset X through a data service, and it has an endpoint. This is what APIs have. APIs have an endpoint, or this kinds of URLs where you go if you have access to it, and then you put in there your search question, and then you get the result out of that. Again, this is kind of the same information you see on the right-hand side, the descriptors that are defined for it, and you say what kind of type it is. It's a view service, it's an update service, or something like that. Visualizations is one of the services that are being provided. When the data service was released, what the license is, and how you get to it. Those are the kind of things that people need to know about data services. There are quite a lot of other descriptors that you can use, but this is just an example of how you describe them in the context that you get an API or an. Yeah, so about the DCAT process and maintenance cycle, I think that's important for people to understand that these things are formally discussed. It's not something that a small group of people comes up with and then it's being published. There is a process and maintenance cycle. In the way that W3C normally works, the standards, the specifications that are being published by W3C are developed by working groups. Those are established formally, and they consist of W3C members. Those are paying members. They could either commercial organizations or governments, or anybody could be a member, and they pay a membership fee. But they also can have invited experts in working groups. And the working groups have chairs and volunteer editors who make sure that the discussions take place and that the results are published on the W3C website. The way that those groups work is that they work with wiki pages and an open GitHub repository for discussion. That discussion is open for everybody. It's visible to the world. You don't have to have a login to go there. Of course, you have to have a GitHub account if you want to comment, but that's completely free. The working groups have bi-weekly meetings, usually, or every 2 weeks. The meetings are restricted to members of the working group. So to make sure that the discussion is focused, people have to be a member of the working group. But whatever happens in the working group is open. So the archive is open, you can see what happens. So the things that I was telling about, the discussions that took place about adding a data service, for example, you can always look that up in the open archive, and there are live links here if you have the presentation, that you can actually click on that and see what happened. And W3C is fairly strict in how they work. So there is a whole sequence of documents that need to be provided by a working group. Working drafts, last call working draft, and going into a candidate recommendation. Importantly, to see that one thing before a specification becomes a recommendation, there is a requirement to provide an implementation report. So it's not something that is just paper, a specification, but it also needs to be demonstrated that the candidate recommendation is being implemented, and that is necessary for a specification to become a recommendation. In the decision process around those documents, it's always the case that there is community review. So the review is open. It is announced by W3C. People can comment, everybody can comment, and there is a requirement on the working group to handle each and every comment. So every comment that comes in for community review needs to be recorded, needs to be resolved, and then the commenter needs to get an answer on the comment that they made. So it's an open process. It tries to make sure that the community is aware of what happens. The community have the possibility to to give their comments and suggestions. In the end, the decision is taken by W3C membership, and in the end, it's going to be the W3C director, Tim Berners-Lee, who puts their signature under the recommendation. But in that process, the W3C membership and the director will make sure that the whole process, the open process of community review, is being handled correctly. One thing that just happened last year is that W3C actually had a process where at the end of when a recommendation was published, that was the end of the line. If there was a need to do a revision of a recommendation, then there was no way to do that apart from setting up a new working group. Now, W3C saw, and especially DCAT was one of the examples, that you really can't do that in that way. You really need to have a process that goes on. That when you have a specification, you have a need to do revisions, because there is experience, there are new ideas, there is new possibilities, and they call that now an evergreen recommendation, which means that it will be continuously in maintenance. And the working group that is responsible for that is this dataset exchange working group that is currently working on DCAT-3. And the idea is that not necessarily having a fixed release schedule, but doing the work that is necessary and publish a new version when the work has been done. So that is something that is relatively new, but it's working now for DCAT, and we will see that in about a year or so, there will be a new DCAT version 3. And as I said, that discussion takes place on GitHub and in the archive of the working group. So everybody is invited also to have a look at that and contribute their ideas and their suggestions to this work. And that's where we want to have some questions. I think, Agnieszka, you have...
Yes, I have here questions on the chat. Participants can also unmute themselves. We have here a question from Carlo. The description of the data is only at dataset level, so you can describe the dataset's characteristics, but not the field level.
No, that's correct. What the DCAT does is DCAT describes sort of the outer layer. It can tell you what kinds of data is there, but it actually doesn't describe the data itself. There are standards that are available for describing the data. For example, in the statistical field, there is SDMX, where you actually have a way of describing what the fields in the data mean. But DCAT is open on that, because DCAT would work for Excel files, for XML files, for whatever you have, but it only describes sort of the outer layer. What is it? Who published it? What is it about? But not the details within the dataset.
Okay, so another question. Suppose we are designing a repository of ontologies and we decide on using DCAT-2, DCAT-AP for EU to be the metadata standard for it. Question 1. So for such a repository, the datasets will be ontologies considered as conceptual entities, and their various serializations in RDF, XML, and free, etc. will be distributions, etc. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah, so the data set is the conceptual content, and then in the distribution, you describe the actual characteristics of the file, so the format, and for example, also the schema that the data conforms to. But that's correct.
Okay. And question 2, again, suppose we annotate both ontologies as datasets and ontology files in RDF, XML, and free, etc. as distributions. Can we also annotate data services which provide such distributions using DCAT? I mean to ask, can we annotate both distributions and data services together?
Well, you would describe them separately. Together, of course, there might be overlaps of what the descriptions are, but the idea is that a data service describes an API and a distribution describes a file. So if you have files that you can find through a data service, then of course you have two routes to it, but the descriptions would be separate.
Okay, and another question. Grateful if you could say a bit on descriptions of data sets by other data sets. Example, the attribute of file formats, JSON, etc. is reference data, vocabularies, classification, sys, and any other data set.
I don't understand that question.
Wait, I will. Maybe Martin, maybe you want to unmute yourself and clarify the question.
Happy to do so, thanks. So now my question is related to that. I guess a number of the descriptors that you have, it can be file format, JSON, etc. But as I understand also, for example, different areas of interest, whether it's a data set is related to agriculture, to construction, etc. Those classifications and reference data will in themselves be data sets as well, I suppose. So when you want to control the markings of different attributes of the data sets. So my question is related to, is a data set also in a scopes sense? Do you have a data set will also in a scope sense be a business vocabulary?
Yeah, that can be. Well, so there's always, when you talk about metadata, the different levels. We're talking, for example, you have a data set which is a spreadsheet of sensor data or something like that. So you describe that data set. Now, in describing that data set, you might need to link to, as you say, controlled vocabularies or keyword files or code lists. Code lists themselves might also be data sets. So what you do is from the description of your spreadsheet, you provide a reference to a term in the vocabulary, which in itself can be described as a data set. But there are two different things. So you have links from one description of a data set to an element in another data set. It's very possible. But if you want to describe your ontology or your vocabulary, you could use DCAT to actually describe the ontology. But that's the level of description of the ontology that can be used then to be referred to from the description of the spreadsheet.
Okay, and I think that the last question with before the coffee break, which metadata standard scheme can we use to capture element level metadata of datasets distributions, which will also ensure conformance to DCAT-AP?
You want to describe that a little bit?
I don't know if the participant Mayuk can you unmute yourself and we cannot hear you. Again? No, I think we cannot.
I think what the question is, how can you I think DCAT can be used to describe what is being asked. What you do is you can provide information about datasets and distributions used on the basis of DCAT. That's the standard that you can use. DCAT doesn't say anything about the standard that you can use to actually describe the data, the internal structures of the data. And DCAT allows you to use any standard that is available to describe the internal structure and content of the data.
Okay, I think there are still some questions, but I think that maybe now we can have a coffee break, and we will have another question round after the second part. So now coffee break till 43, till 10:43. Okay?
Okay.
So, see you after. Okay, so I hope that you all had a nice coffee break, and now I think we can continue. the questions we didn't, that Makx didn't have time to reply now, we will reply at the end of the second part, because we will have a bit more of time for the questions and answer.
Okay, so welcome back. Let's dig into DCAT-AP then for the next session of the training. And like to say that, first of all, we usually refer to DCAT-AP and DCAT-AP, but it's shorthand because it has a longer title. The DCAT-AP that we're talking about has as a title the application profile, the DCAT application profile for data portals in Europe. Because for an application profile, it's important to say what the application is. So what is it used for? So what we have defined at the development of DCAT-AP is that it was going to be used for describing public sector datasets in Europe, to enable a cross-data portal search for datasets to make this data better searchable across borders and sectors. So particularly what I showed at the beginning with the diagram, DCAT-AP is used to create the interoperability between these data portals, and then in the end for aggregating that information at the European data portal. So that's the application that it was designed for. It was developed in the context of the ISA and ISA squared program, and that's the European Commission program, interoperability solutions for public administration between businesses and citizens. It was developed by a working group with representation from the member states and other experts. And it started in 2011. And in the previous part, I said that the work on DCAT started in 2010, and the work on DCAT-AP started in 2011, so a little bit later, based on the work that was taking place on DCAT at the University of Galway. Now, the discussions of the development of DCAT-AP took place from 2011, and it was the version 1 was published in September 2013. Now, there's an interesting point there, because what I said earlier, the W3C standard was published in January 2014. So the application profile of DCAT was published before the standard at W3C was finalized. So that had a little bit of a problem that also led to version 2 being developed of DCAT-AP, published in November 2019, that also took care of a couple of things that were different between DCAT-AP of 2013 and the final specification of DCAT at W3C. But DCAT-AP is also a work that is taking place currently. So version 2 has been published. This is the current version published in 2019, but there is ongoing development, and a new version is probably going to be published later this year or next year. One thing about application profile, as I said, an application profile DCAT-AP is developed for a particular application, and application profiles in general are defined as specifications that reuse terms from one or more base standards. In this case, DCAT-AP reuses terms from DCAT at W3C, but it adds more specificity, identifying mandatory, recommended, and optional elements to be used for a particular application, as well as recommendations for controlled vocabularies to use. This is a definition that comes from the DCAT-AP specification, and it's based on earlier work on defining what an application profile is. The article at the bottom that you see here was actually an article from 2000, the year 2000, that was about how you can actually implement metadata standards, and the application profile was something that was defined as important for that. In a little bit of more general terms, I always refer to the base standard as being like a dictionary. So it defines all the words that exist in a particular language, the things that you can say. Whereas an application profile is like a style guide. It selects the words from the dictionary and tells you how to use them in a particular context. And that is something that is important to understand, that if you have an application profile, you identify the words that you're going to use, the entities, the characteristics, the descriptors, but you describe how you're going to use them to meet the goal of that particular application. The DCAT-AP has also a process of maintenance cycle. It's also defined and published. It is clear that this is developed and maintained by the ISA squared working group that is still in operation. And there is currently, there are activities around that for development of the next version. The work of that working group is chaired by the Commission, by the European Commission, and the European Commission usually subcontracts the editor of the work to a subcontractor. Publication is on JoinUp. I'm pretty sure many people know what JoinUp is, a site where information and specifications of the European Commission are published. There is a GitHub repository where discussion takes place, so you can find the issues that are currently under discussion. And there are regular virtual meetings that are all open, and those are being advertised and announced on JoinUp. Decisions in the DCAT-AP working group are based on consensus. So the idea, the same way, more or less, that WPC works, you have people who come in and provide their suggestions, their comments, and the working group discusses those to find a solution and a resolution that all the members are happy with. There is also a formal change in the release policy for DCAT-AP that have different processes for bug fixes that take place every 6 months, minor versions that are that have changes to semantics and to descriptions, to specifications that are not that, let's say, not that important. And there are major versions that might have additional things that might change things every 2 years, but only if necessary. So there is a process that every 6 months an activity is started to find out whether there are any bug fixes. Every year there's an activity to see if there are any minor changes, and every 2 years a process to develop major changes if necessary. So the data models, the DCAT-AP data model, as it is an application profile, you could imagine, you could understand, but it's identical to the DCAT data model. So the same entities, the same descriptors that you have. The only thing that is different is that DCAT-AP provides obligations. So for implementers of DCAT-AP, it's clear which fields need to be provided. So mandatory elements, there are recommended elements and optional elements. So the mandatory ones you must provide. The recommended ones are the ones that you should provide if possible. And the optional elements are things that you may provide if you think that it would be useful for other people to have information about. In DCAT-AP, there are additional properties, additional descriptors added to DCAT, which are not in DCAT. So that's possible also. So in the way that an application profile can reuse the elements of more than one base standard. So there are things that are being used from other standards as well. Secondary identifiers, versioning information, provenance for datasets, so where they come from, how did they came into being. And for distributions, there are availability, status, and a checksum to check that the file is correct. And the DCAT-AP also provides a list of required control vocabularies. And because DCAT-AP operates in the European environment under a European program, most of the controlled vocabularies that are being required for DCAT-AP are from the publications office's EU vocabularies. For example, languages, countries, the data themes that I referred to earlier are all things that are in the specification of DCAT-AP as mandatory controlled vocabulary. Now, if we compare DCAT to DCAT-AP in the things that it contains, so as I said, DCAT is a base standard, so it provides a set of potentially useful terms for description. There is no mention of obligation or cardinalities. There are only general recommendations of how to use DCAT in non-normative notes and examples. And there are some suggestions for controlled vocabularies, and at least it says that for these descriptors, it's best to use a controlled vocabulary, and it might give a suggestion, but it's certainly not requiring, doesn't make that mandatory because it wants to keep things open. So the benefits of that is that it's a flexible approach. You can apply it in different environments with specific requirements. So it's a base standard, it's a base vocabulary that you can use, and you can have different implementations. But the good thing about having the base standard is that even if these implementations have slightly different approaches, it will still use the same basic terms. So even if there are different application profiles, so to say, there are still common elements that you can use to understand more or less what the application profile is trying to tell you. So this is the idea of the base standard. Of course, there is also a challenge, because if you want to use a standard set of descriptors, then you might already have an implementation of a catalog that uses slightly different concepts. Now, you need to have that, the further agreements that you need to have an understanding is something that DCAT doesn't provide you the tools for. So it only provides you for the basic understanding that you could have between different implementations. On the other hand, DCAT-AP is exactly that, the provision of further agreements for a particular application. And then it adds these mandatory recommended option elements, but it also has quite a lot of usage notes, so that you can actually understand how these terms from DCAT, these descriptors that DCAT is described, in this particular application would be applied. So what does it mean in the particular context? How do you use this particular descriptor? And the required use of controlled vocabularies also creates more interoperability, because then you know that everybody who implements DCAT-AP uses the same controlled vocabulary, the same terminologies to describe their information. So that gives you the benefit of a full understanding of how the elements are used, and it guarantees a higher level of interoperability. The challenge is, again, that you might have to adapt a little bit your existing practice to the standard model. There is, of course, always in terms of using standards, there is always a challenge that a standard requires you to do things in a common way, and therefore you might need to adapt the way that you work. What we can see also, there is also, as I said earlier, an application profile that was developed by the Publications Office of the EU for the EU Open Data Portal, where open data published by EU institutions and bodies are brought together. And the difference between the two, between DCAT-AP, the general one, and DCAT-AP that is being used for the Publications Office, that DCAT-AP is specifically for the data portals in Europe. So the goal of DCAT-AP is to feed information into the central aggregator, the European data portal. Then the European data portal can use those descriptions to aggregate an index, and it provides in the specification a minimum set of mandatory elements. This is something that was part of the discussion that we had in the development of DCAT-AP, because there were many people around the table from different countries, and we tried to find out what would be the sensible minimum set of descriptors of data sets and distributions. And it turned out the set was fairly small, because of course, because of current practices in different countries, some countries would be able to provide more information than others, and in the end, the only two descriptors that are mandatory for data sets are a title and a description. For the distribution, the only thing that is required is access. So in a very basic system, you would only know what the data set is by looking at the description, and you would only know where to find the data by following the SQL. Of course, this is something that you wouldn't want to have a system that only does that. But it was because of the discussion that we had, because of the various suggestions that were made by different countries, that was the minimum mandatory set that we defined. Now, there is quite a lot of recommended descriptors in the standard. Most of those are used by the people that provide the information, and they are called in the standard, they are called recommended. On the DCAT-AP for the Publications Office, the idea was that it would remain fully conformant with DCAT-AP, which means that it would respect the minimum set of mandatory elements and use as many of the recommended descriptors as possible. But it added some things to it. For example, it also made in the description of a data set the publisher mandatory. Say, well, because this is information that comes from the European institutions, we need to know who provided that information. So that's the publisher is the mandatory. It added a couple of attributes to the catalog record to record the number of views and the number of downloads, which would be important for the application that is built on it, the open data portal. And it added mandatory distribution type to distribution, so you can make a distinction between visualizations and files, for example. But as I said, it remains fully conformant with the basic DCAT-AP, so that the data that is available in the EU Open Data Portal can, without any problem, also be harvested in the European Data Portal, the central portal. There are other DCAT profiles as well, and we will talk about the profiles also in the second webinar in a little bit more detail. But there are, in the context of the work that the European Commission does and the work that also the ISA program has been doing, there are other application profiles. The STAT DCAT application profile, which was developed with the help of Eurostat, adds a couple of descriptors that are relevant for data sets that come from statistics. For example, it has some possibilities to provide the dimensions of the data in the data set, and a very small amount of extra things and controlled vocabularies that are still, again, like the DCAT-AP-OP, still fully compliant with the general DCAT-AP for data portals. GeoDCAT is another one that was developed with the help of the Joint Research Center and provides a specification of how to use DCAT for geospatial information. Again, being completely in line and compliant with the general DCAT-AP. And a more recent initiative was the development of a DCAT application profile for base registries, which is something that is still ongoing. So those are the kinds of things that currently have been taking place at the European Commission, and that in the next webinar, the second webinar, we will talk about a little bit more about additional application profiles and how they relate to DCAT-AP. One thing that I wanted to also talk about is one issue that has come up a couple of times during the development of DCAT and DCAT-AP is, what is a dataset? In fact, what do you describe with DCAT and with DCAT-AP? And there was, at a couple of points during the development over the last 10 years, the question, can we define what kind of things can be considered data sets? And that was, well, it's an interesting discussion, and it took place, I think, at least 3 times. The issue there was that we don't have a view of what data is. There are so many different types of data, and a data set is defined as a collection of data. And then when we were talking about that, it was clear that everybody understood and everybody agreed that spreadsheet-like data, things that are like two-dimensional data that you would put in a spreadsheet, was a valid thing to describe as a data set. But then there was other things. So the question has been asked today also about an ontology, a controlled vocabulary with a set of terms. Well, maybe people would be inclined to say, yes, you can do that. There's actually work that has been done by the Commission and other people on doing that. So that was more or less agreed. But then people came up with an audio file with a set of interviews. Is that a data set? Now there were different opinions on that. And someone came up with a legal act with a set of articles, and there was pushback against that. People said, well, no, you can't really see that as a data set. Now, in the end, we had to decide that we actually couldn't agree. So what came out of that discussion is that it's basically up to the implementer. If you have a set of things, of files, of things where you think that describing them with DCAT as datasets is useful for you, then it should. There's no one that should tell you you can't. In the end, it's really a set of descriptors for things that are data that are published or created by a single agent that can be used to be described as a DCAT dataset. That's something that came up, and I wanted to just share with you, and maybe there are some questions about that. Also, what the other thing that I wanted to talk to you briefly is that there's also other approaches, of course, to describing data sets. Many of you will be aware of CCAN, the software tool to describe and publish data sets, originally developed by the Open Knowledge Foundation, which has a model that is sort of similar to what DCAT has. The only thing that you can see in CCAN that is a little different is that in CCAN, data sets are related to resources, and resources are a little broader than DCAT distributions. For example, there's also a resource could also be documentation about the data set or any other type of information that are related to the data set. Now there is a CCAN extension to map the CCAN model to DCAT, and there is a link there to it that you can see here. And that is something that you can look at, and that is already being used in various places. And then the other thing is about schema.org. I guess everybody heard of schema.org. developed by Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Yandex. And Schema.org just used the DCAT model. They started looking at the way to build at Google the dataset search, and they looked at DCAT and they said, well, that's a very useful way to doing things. And so they just used the definition of dataset and distribution from DCAT. But in most cases, Schema.org is a little less strict in semantics, so the definitions are a little bit broader than for DCAT. DCAT actually has in the specification an annex where you can see the mapping to Schema.org. So there was an initiative to look at how those things could work together. So that's another point where Schema.org and DCAT are related, and you can actually see how they are related to the DCAT specification. That's for the presentation, so we can have some questions.
Yes, yes. So maybe we will first go back to the two questions that we have still from part one. So Stefano was asking if a web page where you can consult a database and filter some slices of content is also considered as a data service, more for humans than for machines.
Yes, well, the question, I think, of can I do this or can I do that? I think it's open. I think DCAT itself, as a standard, is very open in how you can use it. So if you see a need and you see a possibility to use DCAT descriptions for your case, then then you can do that. DCAT-AP is, of course, a little bit more prescriptive, because DCAT-AP actually defines what it is for, it defines the application, so it tells you what you can do and how you can do it. So the particular question, I think that these particular issues are maybe a little bit outside the scope of the presentation today, but the general answer is if it works for you, then you can do it. And there is ways in the DCAT specification that gives you some examples that might be helpful to decide how to do it.
Okay, another question from Jean-Baptiste. Are all fields of DCAT datasets descriptions localized? Let's say I want to have the title of my dataset in both English and French, but also the publisher name, the keywords, etc.
Well, that's a very good question. It's a very important issue. The way that DCAT and DCAT-AP handle that is that it allows most of those fields to be repeatable. So you can have, for example, a description field. You can publish that in any language that you want, and you can publish in all languages that you want. So what DCAT and DCAT-AP doesn't do is tell you how to do that. So it just gives you the option of providing translations, but DCAT will not do the translations for you. So that's the thing, that DCAT provides the possibilities, but if you want to provide multilingual information, then you must provide that yourself. And there is a chapter in the DCAT-AP specification that provides you with how you can do that.
Okay, another question from Jean-Baptiste. Is it easy to migrate from one model DCAT to another DCAT-AP if necessary at some point?
Well, the idea currently of the DCAT application profiles that I mentioned in the presentations is that they're all, let's say, compliant with DCAT-AP. But of course, there might be differences between one and the other. That's clear. So, is it easy? Well, it depends a little bit on which application profiles you're comparing. But in the end, the ones that we have in Europe, the ones that we're talking about today and in this training, would still be all compliant with the base DCAT-AP. So in that sense, there is a commonality there. And if you have different approaches in different, for example, different national application profiles, then it would not automatically be interoperable, but that would be, you would need to look at that on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, another question for David, who is interested if DCAT-AP is used outside of the EU, and is there anything EU-specific that would prevent it being used outside of the EU?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. There's nothing that would prevent people outside of the EU or outside of Europe to use it. But as I said, DCAT-AP was designed for this network of national and domain data portals to feed into the European data portal. So in that sense, if you have an application that provides aggregation of data sets in the US, you might not use DCAT-AP. There is no way that you prevent that, but one thing that I know would be a little bit difficult for people outside of Europe to use it is because we use European controlled vocabularies. So that's something that might not be relevant for other countries. And you can see that, for example, in the United States, there is an application profile for DCAT for the US, which is not compliant with DCAT-AP in Europe, but has quite a lot of overlap between the two. So there is no reason that people couldn't use it, but in the practice, people would probably develop their own application profile for DCAT.
Okay, thank you. Now a question from Vanessa. Is the current DCAT-AP for EU portals based on DCAT version 2?
That's a question I can't really answer with authority. I think what is the case is that DCAT-AP was fully developed on DCAT version 1, but some of the additions in DCAT-AP version 2 are already being available in DCAT version 2. So it's a little bit of a tortoise and a hare problem. They both move forward and they interact between them. That's something that we're also going to talk to about in webinar 2. But I think that, no, you can't say that DCAT version 2 is based on DCAT version 2, DCAT-AP version 2. But I know that in the current work that is being done on DCAT-AP, people are looking back into DCAT version 2 and even DCAT version 3 to make sure that there is an alignment. This has been a problem. As I said earlier, DCAT-AP was published 4 months before the recommendation was ready at WPC, which means that there is a little bit of a difference between the two. And the same happens now, and I think both groups are interested to align as much as possible.
Okay, now a question related to Vanessa's from Els. Do DCAT2 and DCAT-AP exist in parallel, or we can see DCAT-AP as a more restrictive subversion of DCAT2?
Well, as I said, there is a little bit of a synchronization issue there because they have their own development cycles. But yes, I think what you can say is that in general, DCAT-AP or any application profile restricts a little bit how you're using DCAT. So anything that DCAT is very open. You can do the base standard. You can do anything. You can use any of those fields, but you don't have to. DCAT-AP is really more restrictive because it actually tells you which ones to use, and also, for example, which controlled vocabularies to use. So in that sense, it's more restrictive because it's more precise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, is DCAT-AP-OP a separate standard or an application of DCAT-AP? Is it something like the other profiles you showed, GeoDCAT, etc.?
Yeah, so the idea is that that's a staircase. You have the base on the bottom, you have the base standard, which is DCAT at the WPC. Then you have the next step up is DCAT-AP, which is the European standard for data portals. And then you have something like DCAT-AP-OP, which sits on the next stair. They're all compatible, so DCAT-AP-OP is compatible with DCAT-AP and also compatible with DCAT. So in that sense, you have a staircase of being more precise, let's say. But the idea is that they're still backward compatible.
Okay, then we have some questions from Mayuk, but they are quite detailed. So I don't know, or you can try, Max, to reply now to them.
Yeah, if they're more detailed.
So they are more detailed. So yeah. I think we can reply on. You can write the replies.
Yeah.
And then there is another question from Martin. Is there a common EU API through which we can retrieve controlled vocabularies of relevance to the descriptors in DCAT? But I think it will be covered in webinar 2 when you will speak about controlled vocabularies in details. Okay, I don't know if there are more questions, or we can go back to the questions that Mayuk asked, the more detailed one. So in the context of CCAN data repository, does there exist a mapping from DCAT-AP version 2.01 to CCAN metadata files or datasets distributions? The CCANext DCAT only mentions mapping from DCAT-AP version 1.
That's a question that I don't have an answer to. I think that we need to talk to CCAN to see what they're doing there. I know there was really an interest of CCAN a couple of years ago to build this extension to expose CCAN metadata as DCAT-AP, but I'm not quite sure what the current status is. I think that there should be an interest if DCAT-AP moves forward with new versions, but also CCAN users would be interested to have a mapping to the new version of DCAT-AP, but that is something that I can't answer now.
Okay. Second question, if our needs for a repository exceeds DCAT-AP, can we fall back to DCAT-2 and other domain-specific metadata schemas and design a customized DCAT-AP profile only for our repository? Will that be compliant or in conformance with DCAT-based repository requirements?
Well, yeah, you can do that. Of course, everybody is free to build their own application profile. So what you want to add that is not in DCAT-AP but is in DCAT-2, then of course you can add that, and that is something that people will do. If you do that in a way that respects the conformance requirements of DCAT-AP, will still be conformant to that, and it will still be able to interop with DCAT-AP. But the extra things that you add to it might not be understandable for others. So if you have a group of organizations that want to build a DCAT-AP specifically for that repository, for that application, you can do that. You can, if you do that respecting the rules of the extensions of DCAT-AP, then you can interwork, for example, with the European data portal. But some of the things that you have in the customized profile might not be understandable for others.
Okay, and the last question, if you want our data repository to be exposed internationally, can we still use DCAT-AP, or do you recommend the broader DCAT-2 or even a customized DCAT-AP profile?
Well, that's the question of what you want to do. Yes, if you want to have your interoperability wider, then you might want to do another application profile. Just to say that DCAT-2 is not an application profile. DCAT-2 is a base standard. So you can always use that, but you need to decide on how you're using it. The way that DCAT-AP decides on how to use DCAT by providing mandatory elements, by saying which default vocabularies you want to use. But yeah, if you if you keep on using anything that is in DCAT2, then certainly you can interoperate. If you have, for example, you want to interoperate both with Europe and the DCAT-AP, and you want to interoperate with the US with the DCAT US application profile, then you need to analyze what you need to do to make them compliant with both. Of course, both of them are based on DCAT, the WCAG standard. Some might use a little bit of DCAT2 and others not, but that is something that you need to determine. I think from my perspective, there is no way that you can create interoperability with everybody for every purpose. You always need to look at who do you want to interoperate with and for what purpose. Using DCAT, the standard for WCAG as a basis, means that there will always be a common way, because you use the same words, as I say, from the vocabulary, from the dictionary. You will still be able to understand each other, but it might be limited in the sense that there might be things in your specification that others don't understand. But there are certainly things in your specification that everybody understands. So it depends a little bit on how deep you want your interoperability to be. If you want to only shallow based on the words and the elements of DCAT standard, then you can do that. If you really want to do more than that, then you probably would need to develop an application profile, and you would need to talk to people who use the same application profile to see what your interoperability can do.
Okay, I think we have another, maybe last question from Beza. In which occasions, use cases, we should choose to use DCAT or DCAT-AP? Do you have any examples?
Well, as I said, if you want to cooperate, interoperate in the network that allows the European data portal to harvest data, then your choice is DCAT-AP. Because you have this application, you want to play a role, you want to play in this application, so that is the definition. If you have more general requirements, you want to be sort of more open to everybody in the whole world, then you might want to limit yourself to DCAT, the standard, and have a more flexible approach. So I think particularly the use of DCAT-AP is bound to you wanting to play a role in this network that feeds data into the European data portal. If you're not, then you might want to use your own open application profile for your own group of organizations, for example. So there's a decision to be taken. What do you want to achieve? Do you want to play in this network with the European data portal? Then DCAT-AP is your choice. If you have other requirements, other networks that you want to play a role in, then you might want to build your own application profile, which might be different from DCAT-AP.
Okay, so I think this was the last question for today. Just for the participants, so you know, there is a link here in the chat to a Slido poll where you can vote for the topics for the webinar 3, because there are many questions that will be in webinar 2 or 3. So you can have a look there. And I'm sorry, because I think I jumped in. Max has still one slide with the learning objectives for the webinar 2. So
yeah, so I think it's good. Maybe the slides should be in a different order. But yeah, this is as Jessica said, we have the 3 webinars. This one was for basic information about DCAT and DCAT-AP. The next one is about for basic users, so the topics for the second webinar that we are doing on the 22nd of March, so in 2 weeks' time on Monday morning. We go a little bit more deeper in some of the things that we talked about today. We talk a little bit about the concept of linked data, because that is the context that DCAT and DCAT-AP work. So we look a little bit more at RDF and at linked data and how that works. We look at the vocabularies that are used in DCAT and DCAT-AP, and so we look at these mandatory, recommended, and optional classes and properties in DCAT-AP, what they are, why are they there, what they do for you. And then the controlled vocabularies used in DCAT-AP, the vocabularies the question was asked today. And then we look at some examples and existing guidelines for the use of DCAT-AP. So we'll do that in 2 weeks' time. Then there is the third webinar, which we have a little bit more open. One of the things that we want to do in the third webinar, which is for advanced users, is actually address issues that you bring up. So therefore, here in the Slido, where you can put issues that you think might be interesting to cover in webinar 3, and then we'll make a selection of them that we can discuss there. And the webinar, the third webinar, is then on the 19th of April. So between your suggestions after the 22nd of March, we have the time to work out how we want to develop that webinar and how we can take into account the suggestions. And then again, at the bottom here, the webinars will be published on the YouTube channel of the Education Office, where you can hear them back. That's Agnieszka, handing back to you.
Yes, so I think that's all for today, and thank you very much for the participation, and thank you.